Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're going to look at Gardens. This is a 4-cost victory card from the base game, and it says worth 1 point per 10 cards you have, round down. So how many points this is worth? At the end of the game, you just count the total number of cards that you own, which is to say all the ones that you haven't trashed, and if you've crossed a threshold, 30, 40, 50, something like that, you will get more points for the Gardens based on how many cards you have. So this is a pure victory card. It doesn't do anything for you during the game. It only scores points at the end, sort of like Province and Duchy, but it's worth a variable amount. Now, in order to discuss this properly, we haven't yet discussed anything about how you end games in Dominion and the whole concept of victory cards and when you use them and what you want to do with the strategy around them. So we're going to talk generically about the end games in Dominion first, and then we're going to move on to Gardens specifically. So in Dominion, players are in full control of when the game ends. There's no fixed time length to the game or anything like that. It only ends when certain states have been achieved, and the players contribute towards putting the game towards that state. And what that means is that to some extent, you slightly get to control the pace of the game, how long it goes on for and how many turns. It's all going to depend on what the players are doing, and that includes you. So you get a little bit of control as to how the game goes in that regard. There's a saying in the Dominion community that sort of goes a little something like this, and it says, Dominion is not about having the most points when the game ends, but ending the game when you have the most points. So that's just highlighting how you, the player, are sort of in control of when Dominion ends, and your strategy is going to depend based on that. So let's take a look at something which should be a little bit Dominion 101, but it's worth repeating. How do you actually win when you play a game of Dominion? So there's a couple of rules that sort of trigger the actual end of the game. So you should know when the province pile empties, when the colony pile empties, and when either a third pile empties or a fourth pile, and fourth pile is for 5 and 6 player games. So those are the obvious ones that you're sort of told about very early on, and obviously you only want to end the game when you're in the lead. But there are sort of other ways in which the game is effectively over, without being officially over, that are also important to note. So one of them is that you have so many points that there's literally not enough points left in the game for your opponent to actually beat you. This is something that we refer to as 50% VP. It means you've got half of all of the remaining victory points, or the total victory points. Worth noting that not every kingdom has a flat, static amount of points that are available. So like Gardens itself, for example, is one where the points, in theory, can just keep going up, the points that are available. But also, you can sometimes reduce the total number of points that are available. So, like if you, for example, remodel a province into another province, that hasn't gained you any points, but it has taken a province off of the out of the supply. And that means that not only is it easier to just empty the pile, but also there's less points available in total in that game. Another thing that happens sometimes, you get these victory point tokens, and sometimes you can get a case where someone has so many victory points that even though the game is not over, it's effectively impossible to catch up. One example I've written here, there's a thing called the Bishop Fortress Golden deck. You don't need to worry about that now, but that's basically a strategy that gains infinite points forever, 12 points per turn, and it does it without actually ever ending up in a state where the game ends, because it doesn't actually reduce any of the supply piles while it does it. You don't have to gain any more cards in order to gain all of these points. So that's a situation where, effectively the game wouldn't come to a close, but it'd be pretty obvious when someone has essentially won. So these are really important because that's actually a number of different ways that you can win the game in Dominion. It's not quite so simple as many other games. Now, one core rule to think about when you're playing your deck is that if your opponent is beating you on one of these win conditions, then you probably shouldn't help them out on reaching that win condition. So it's very kingdom dependent, but sometimes you get the opportunity to change your strategy to go towards one of the other end game conditions, and by doing that you sort of try and delay or stop your opponent from reaching their endgame condition. So, for example, if your opponent is trying to rush the provinces as soon as possible, they're getting like one province every turn, you might consider instead to stop buying provinces and start trying to build to pick up multiple duchies every turn. Like, if you can just keep on building your deck and end up getting to a state where you can buy like 3 duchies every turn, it won't take long until you've caught up like 4 provinces worth of points, essentially. If you instead drained the province pile, you sort of give them an opportunity to end the game while they are in the lead and it's favourable to them. Some of these sorts of decks that are only looking to buy 1 province per turn, especially if your opponent starts on it pretty quickly, they're going to have a deck that really can't actually handle that many victory cards, right? Their deck is susceptible to just sputtering out, and that's sort of why they're going for provinces early. But if you can force them to try and drag that game on and make them feel like they have to start, buying a load of duchies one at a time themselves, you can basically force their deck to fall apart. A really important part of Dominion is the way that pure victory cards, which is what you're using most of the time to get your points, are really, really bad for decks. You kind of want as few of them as you possibly can, which is why like Province is so good. And if you start buying victory cards too early, you find that your deck just collapses, and that gives the person who's trying to build the exciting engine more chance to catch up. There are some deck builders that tried to make the way you gain points also the same as like really powerful cards that you play. And the problem is that those games just snowball. Someone gets ahead and there's nothing that they can do. They can't ever sort of, in a way, make a misplay to not win because their deck gets better while they add points. Not so much in Dominion. The actual playing of your deck tends to get worse. So sometimes you can use that to your advantage by forcing your opponent to make their deck bad. If you have a deck that can support more victory cards, you can drag the game out by not going towards one of those end conditions and force your opponent to try and basically clog up their deck. On the other side of the spectrum, you may find that you're playing an opponent that can gain quite a lot of cards every turn. Maybe they get a lot of money in buys and gains, and the game's getting pretty close to ending on 3 piles. So if you imagine you have an opponent that can gain like 4 cards every turn, you sort of don't want to get to a state where the game can be ended by buying 3 cards because they have 1 extra gain, and they might be able to gain those 3 cards and then an estate, and that causes them to end the game with a 1-point lead over you. So when you're in that situation where your opponent is doing slightly better than you on that regard, you can try and stop them from sneaking in a win by starting to try and gain as many points as you can, usually from the province pile, and just stop buying cards from those low piles. So you sort of force them into a state where it's like, hey, you can't end the game while also earning any points. So I'm just going to start earning a load of points, and then you are forced to try and respond in kind. You want to keep building your engine and buy from those piles, but you can't, because if you let me get a point lead, I'll just pick up those cards and I don't need to buy the extra estate to win. So that's, again, your opponent's looking to use the end game condition of ending on any 3 piles. So don't help them out. Start looking to change the game and end on a different victory point that's more favourable to you instead. Sorry, win condition, not victory point. Now, there is a caveat to this, of course. I'm talking about how you change to go to a different victory condition as though this is something that's always possible and easy to do. And the reality is that it isn't. Dominion has a lot of variety in it. There's all sorts of different types of games, and sometimes the game only really supports one way that the game's going to end. So if you think about a board, for example, where you can never gain or buy more than your 1 buy per turn. You can only ever add 1 card to your deck every turn. That game is almost certainly going to end up on provinces because it's going to take so long if you just keep building, only gaining 1 card per turn. So that's just the easiest pile to end, and it ends the game. And it's also the best one. Like, if you can only add 1 card to your deck per turn, you'd much rather get province than any other victory card. So in that case, you sort of don't have a choice. But it's good to recognise that because it lets you know what your options are and what you can do, and that will sort of determine how quickly you want to stop building and sort of move into the end game. Sometimes you get cards where if you build just a little bit more, they start to explode in terms of what your deck can do. They give a lot of what I call deck acceleration, where you reach a point where suddenly now you're gaining a whole load of buys and a whole load of money, and you're able to draw your deck very well. And a deck like 2 or 3 turns later is going to be significantly better than it is right now. Those sorts of decks have a lot of acceleration and they build tempo very quickly. And that is also going to play into this. Those sorts of decks have more opportunities to end the game in ways that are favourable to them and have different, options available to them. It's hard to give very generic advice on this regard because it's so kingdom dependent. There's so many different types of cards in Dominion, and they all have very specific features about them. Even cards that are fairly similar tend to be, they're all slightly different. And those slight differences can sometimes have a big impact on how the game works, particularly in combination with others. Now, while I say it's hard to give generic advice, I'm going to try and do it anyway, like the fool that I am. So as you get a lot more practice with Dominion, you start to just get a better feel for how games go, and you sort of start to get a better feel of what sort of decks are possible and how good they are at the different sort of ways that you can end the game. But bear in mind that knowing when you want to start moving into the phase where you're adding victory cards into your deck is honestly still one of the most difficult parts of Dominion. So if it takes you a while to get there and you still don't understand sort of how you're looking to end the game and what sort of route you need to take, don't worry about it, because it genuinely is a very hard thing to do. And that's just because of how Dominion has so much variety, and you have to take every single game on its own individual merits with what's available. As a general rule, though, most decks kind of struggle to support quite a lot of victory cards. So a lot of the pure victory cards, like Province Duchy, they're all just completely useless stop cards. And they really do clog up decks, and you can actually struggle kind of a lot. In a perfect world, decks actually don't want any victory cards at all, except adding them in right at the end. But, on a realistic scale, how often do you have a game like where you buy all 8 provinces in one turn? Right, well, it can happen, but it's not going to happen very often, let's be honest. So you don't always get to play out the perfect world that you want. But as a general concept, that's sort of the platonic ideal that you're always aiming for, is to only buy the number of victory cards that you need and to do it as late as possible. So, given all of that, let's finally move on to talking about Gardens itself. So Gardens is another victory card pile. It gives you another way to score points that isn't just gaining provinces, which, to be fair, is the most common sort of way that people are going to try and score points. Now, Gardens pretty cheap, costing 4. It costs a little bit less than a duchy. And sort of how many cards do you typically end up with in a deck? Well, even with good trashing, like, for example, Chapel, it's not actually that hard to end up with 30 or more cards in your deck. So what you find is that Gardens tends to be, most of the time, the same points as Duchy, or at least very close. I would say that a lot of decks that, if you think about the traditional deck that tries to trash all of its starting cards and then just adds a couple of engine components and ideally adds more than one per turn and eventually tries to buy provinces, you are going to end up somewhere in the high 20s to low 30s number of cards. That's pretty common. So Gardens, a lot of the time, is going to be a cheaper duchy with this sort of theoretical possibility to get a lot better. It's very rare to see a game where Gardens is only worth 1 point. But it can happen. You can have these games where you end your deck with less than 20 cards. I've definitely seen it. But, for the most part, it's going to be 2 or 3 points. And I'd say usually 3. Whereas a duchy that only costs 4, that is the same victory points per coin as province, but it comes in the form of 2 cards instead of 1. And remember, these are completely unplayable stop cards. That's when it's worth 3. Because, the province is 6 points for 8 coins, and that's 3 points for 4 coins. So Gardens, of course, it scales with the size of your deck, but it scales very, very slowly. How long does it take to get 10 cards into your deck? Well, that's going to depend on the kingdom. Obviously, if you only get to add 1 card to your deck every turn, then it's going to take a huge amount of time. But if you can add like 3 or 4, then it doesn't really take that many turns at all. Now, Gardens is nice in that it's only the pure number of cards in your deck. It actually doesn't care what type of cards you have in your deck, only the number of them. And so there's a number of these victory cards. You might know Silk Road or Theoden. They're pure victory cards. They cost 4. There's also Cemetery. So there's a couple. It's sort of like a standard template. Gardens is kind of nice compared to those in the way that, because it doesn't care how you build your deck and what it's composed of, Gardens tends to fit more easily into some of those decks because it lets you build the deck the way that your deck needs to be built in order to run. It's not forcing you to build your deck in a certain way to boost the value of Gardens. It only cares that you've built a lot, really. And if we give a basic analysis on Gardens, though, because you're normally looking, the standard traditional deck type is to trash all of your starting cards that are weak, to then draw your deck every turn and sort of end the game quickly on buying as many provinces as you can. So that sort of strong deck drawing, thin deck, the fact that it tries to be lean is really important. And that's sort of the opposite of what Gardens looks like if you think of it on a basic level. So, Gardens feels kind of bad for those sorts of decks. And to be fair, it sort of is, right? A lot of decks don't want to be huge, and Gardens is sort of trying to promote you to make a huge deck. So if you're feeling like that makes it sound like Gardens is pretty weak, then yeah, it kind of is. Gardens overall is not very strong because of the way that it works against the type of deck that you usually want to build. Now, however, it is a cheap victory card pile, and something that's very important to note is that in 2-player, victory piles only have 8 cards in them. Now, most kingdom piles actually have 10 cards, so victory card piles means there's slightly less cards in it. Now, if you're looking to empty piles as quickly as possible, the fact that there's this pile that has less cards in it sounds like that might be a nice idea, especially because it earns you points as well while you're emptying it. And we also know that 4-cost cards are way, way easier to gain than 5-cost cards. It's a big difference in how much it costs. And you get cards like Workshop that will gain you 4-cost cards instead of 5-cost cards. So if we put all of these properties together, that sounds like there might be a way that Gardens could be useful when you're looking to try and empty 3 piles very quickly. And it is. So there's this sort of strategy known as a rush. Gardens is like the very first and most traditional type of what we call the rush enabler, and that's a strategy where you go in and all you want to do is just empty points as soon as possible. Now, the problem with just trying to empty points as soon as possible is that you need to score, and you need to score enough to beat someone who's just able to pick up 1 or 2 provinces before you end the game. So Gardens is really nice because if you look at Estate and Gardens together, those are 2 piles that are pretty cheap. They're both earning you points. So as long as you have a 3rd pile, then, that sounds like Gardens can really help with that sort of strategy. So one thing to note with strategies with rushes is that, of course, you need a way to empty piles very quickly. So if you have like a 10-pile action card and Gardens and Estate, that's a total of 26 cards that you need to gain. So buying 1 card per turn obviously isn't going to cut it. 26 turns is a ridiculously long game, and anyone buying provinces will quite easily beat that. So you need a way to gain cards really fast. So Workshop is the original traditional, what we call the rush enabler. Workshop Gardens was a strategy that was quite powerful in the first edition base game of Dominion, because you were likely to find those 2 cards together, and a lot of boards tended to be pretty weak. Now, bear in mind that Workshop isn't actually the best at this. There are some similar cards that are kind of like Workshop, but way better for rushes, and I've given 2 examples here, Ironworks and Groom. So Ironworks from Intrigue when you want to gain more ironworks, it gives you your action back. So you can empty ironworks pile very quickly. And then when you do use it to gain victory cards, it cycles you through your deck. It draws you a card, and you're more likely to find another ironworks later on. Groom is one from Menagerie, and when it gains a victory card, it gives you +1 card and +1 action. So it's very easy to just gain a whole load of victory cards very quickly if you have a bunch of Grooms. And Groom Gardens is actually very, very powerful. A lot of traditional engines actually cannot beat Groom's Gardens because it's just so good at emptying victory card piles so quickly. So Workshop Gardens, I don't really want to go too much into it, but just bear in mind, if you look online, there's articles on Dominion Strategy website that talk about Workshop Gardens that were written back in the day. But I can't really talk about Gardens without sort of giving an overview of this sort of basic strategy. So basically, you need a gainer like Workshop. You want to gain a bunch of Workshops first, then you look to gain the Gardens because they're way better than Estates, and then you look to empty the Estates. Now, you don't necessarily empty the Workshop pile straight away. If your opponent is also going to try this strategy on a board, then you want to start picking up the Gardens a little bit sooner. But, I think it was optimal if you're the only player looking to Workshop Gardens. You want 8 workshops first. Really what you're looking to do is make sure you can play 1 workshop a turn. So you open double workshop. You gain enough workshops to try and spread them out throughout your deck and have enough. And then you're looking to gain a Gardens and also buy an estate or a copper every turn. And that's just that strategy. Like I say, it's very basic. A lot of brand new players struggle to beat this just because it's a very easy to play strategy that does okay. Sort of like how Smithy Big Money is very easy to play and does okay. Bear in mind that in 2nd edition base game, Workshop Gardens, you're way, way less likely to see it. And that's because a lot of pretty weak cards got removed from the game and got swapped with much better ones that really prioritise you to build a proper deck. So Workshop Gardens you don't see it as often as you used to. It's not actually super great as a strategy. Most traditional decks will be able to beat it. But to give you an example, this was a kingdom that I generated in my Moat video at the end, at random, and I didn't really know what to do during the video, but after I looked at it later, this is a Workshop Gardens board. And the reason why Workshop Gardens works here is that even though there is an engine with Village and Moat, because you're only trashing as remodel and it's really hard to get rid of the coppers at the start, it's very hard to build a functional deck and it takes a long time. And that means, what other strategy is available? There's not really any sort of card that works well with just a big money strategy. The engine is pretty slow and struggles to get off the ground for a long time. And that means Workshop Gardens sort of has the time to go in and just empty piles pretty quickly before anyone else gets a chance. And you may even find, if your opponent starts trying to remodel coppers into moats or something silly, that maybe there's an easier third pile to empty rather than estates, but it's probably just going to be Workshop Gardens estate. So this is actually a Workshop Gardens board. Like I say, you don't see it very often in 2nd edition, but here's an example of one where you do. So it's still around. Now, okay, so that's enough about that. What about a card like Bureaucrat? That gains you cards, right? Is that better than Workshop in gaining a lot of cards for Gardens? Well, no. And one of the problems is that the copper, silver, and gold piles that are available in every game are really, really big piles. The smallest one, which is gold, has a whopping 30 cards in it, which is enormous. So Gardens Bureaucrat is sort of not a strategy, and that is because it can't actually it cannot deplete a third pile. Even if you are buying Gardens and you're buying estates, how are you emptying a third pile? It's actually very difficult. And so you can't rush with that strategy, right? You are just not able to end the game. And that's a big problem for that strategy. Now, it's important to note, though, that we just mentioned that the treasure piles are very, very big. Right, and if they're very, very big, that means in theory you could gain quite a lot of cards from those piles. Is that good for Gardens? I mean, Gardens wants games where it has a lot of cards in your deck, right? And the reality is that, yeah, it can sometimes. So very occasionally you get cards that appear in the kingdom that really let you gain a heck of a lot of treasures very, very quickly. So here's a card from Dark Ages as an example. called Beggar. This card's really bad normally. You can see the on-play instructions here. It says gain 3 coppers to your hand. You don't normally want to be gaining 3 coppers, but with the Gardens, gaining 3 coppers, you get to, if you play a Beggar on your turn, you can gain at least 4 cards on that one turn. And if you can get 4 cards a turn, Gardens gets, it starts to be worth a lot of points very quickly. Beggar Gardens is a combo. You buy a bunch of Beggars, you buy some Gardens, you buy some possibly even duchies, rather than estates, because you have enough. And you can easily see a Beggar Gardens. If you're the only one doing it, you can get up to 80 points, which is stupid, right? 80 cards in your deck. Rather than 80 points. Gardens can be worth a lot of points. And it does it very, very quickly. So that's like a real combo that can be quite hard to beat. It's quite strong. Delve is an event from Empires. Here's another example. Lets you just gain silvers very cheap. They cost 2 and they don't cost a buy, or at least you get your buy back when you play it. So Delve Gardens, you can just add a whole bunch of silvers into your deck. And as you get a higher density of silvers, you get to gain even more per turn, right? If you draw 5 silvers on your turn, well, you can either gain 5 more silvers, or you could gain 3 silvers and a Gardens, right? So you can see how very quickly that adds a lot. Now, you might be thinking, hey, Theoden is a victory card that's probably going to be a lot better with Delve than Gardens, and yeah, you're right, it is. But, these are just some examples of how you can utilise the fact that the treasure piles are super big, sometimes with these combos, to just make Gardens worth a lot. There are more combos than these two. This is just an example. I don't want to spend the whole video going into very specific combos. I don't think people are probably here just for some more generic advice around Gardens, so we're going to move on. This video is quite long as it is anyway. So what about engines, which is what we call your more traditional deck that's trying to draw every turn? So a lot of the time in Kingdoms, all those cute combos I mentioned, Workshops, Beggar, Delve, they don't really exist, right? Or they can just be too slow. Like Workshop Gardens is not super fast, even though it's an easy strategy that does quite well sometimes. Now, in theory, Gardens wants you to build a lot. If you can get a lot of components, then the Gardens will be worth more for the player who gets to build more. But bear in mind that sometimes, if you think about a game where you've got an engine and you're trying to gain 3 or 4 engine components per turn, right? The engine component action piles, not super big, at only 10 cards, and what you find is that they just deplete very, very fast. And what happens then is that you sort of don't really have time to get Gardens. You're sort of adding so many engine components that you look to just suddenly end the game on a turn, and buying 1 estate is going to be just as good as anything else, because it's just the point that you need to win and get more points than your opponent. Now, sometimes, of course, you can get an engine that has 8 or 9 copies of a whole bunch of engine components, or probably more realistically 7 or so. If you are playing an opponent where you're building the engine and they aren't, you can get these ridiculous decks that just have so many engine components, and you can have a lot of cards at the end of the game. So if you've ever watched this good video series by Burning Skull on YouTube called How to Base Dominion, there is one video in that series where an opponent is just buying gold and not really building the engine. So Burning Skull builds this engine, and he gets so many engine components. He has so many markets and so many merchants and so many villages and smithies and all this, that he actually ends the game with 57 cards in his deck, and he buys a Gardens at some point, and it's almost as good as Province. Against really good players, you just won't see this happen, and that is because if it's right to build the engine, then you sort of need to expect that your opponent's going to do the same and contest you on those piles for important engine components. And if more than one player is gaining cards from a particular pile, that pile will empty pretty quick, and therefore you actually sometimes can't get a lot of cards. And that's just because the piles run out, and so Gardens never has the chance to actually be worth very much. Now, sometimes you get to gain good engine components that don't come from piles that end the game. So the whole 3 supply piles are empty rule that ends the game, some cards actually don't count towards that. And these tend to be cards that you gain from other cards. So Will-O-Wisp and Imp are some examples from the Nocturne expansion. They have quite hefty piles. I think it's like roughly 13-ish of each. Maybe they're slightly less. I can't remember the exact number. Sometimes you get boards where you can actually gain quite a lot of these. And if you think that if you can gain just like 8 Will-O-Wisps or something, like you've got Druid and it gains you Will-O-Wisps, that's quite a lot of cards that's nice for Gardens, that if the pile empties, it's not even counting towards the end of the game. So you can bloat your deck quite a lot with these. Horses from Menagerie, you're probably thinking of a card like Livery from Menagerie. That just gains you a whole bunch of horses. And if you have some sort of ridiculous Livery engine, you may see games where you gain like 18 to 20 horses on one turn. That's a ridiculous number that just... and you're able to gain them all back again, even though when you play a horse, it gets returned to the pile. At the end of the turn, if you then buy like a bunch of Gardens, all of those horses come back into your deck. So when you actually end your turn and the game ends for good, you've gained a load of horses in your deck. So even other horse gaining cards like Supplies are the same. Supplies will just top deck a horse. It's like a copper that top decks a horse when you play it. Because you actually gain that horse at the end of the turn in your buy phase, it will count towards Gardens before you've had a chance to spend it. Even if you are spending that horse every turn, at the end of the game, the Supplies effectively is giving you 2 cards worth of space in your deck instead of 1. So you can find that you just end up with more cards than you typically would at the end of the game, so Gardens will be a bit better. And of course, like Black Market, there's this potentially massive pile of cards. It depends on how you set it up. On the online client at the moment, it's 60 cards in there, and as you buy cards from the Black Market deck, they're all getting added to your deck, and it's not bringing the game to a close, right? It's not actually depleting a pile that counts. So you just get these sort of setups where you can add a whole bunch of good engine cards to your deck, and you're not actually lowering piles. There are other examples. There's like spoils. I'm not here to list all non-supply piles, but I'm sure you will find them as you learn a bit more about Dominion. Occasionally, decks give you quite a lot of extra plus buys. Now, you can use these to buy quite a lot of components on your turn, and that's sort of where you get these explosive engines. But bear in mind that sometimes you can take advantage of this on your last turn to try and make Gardens worth a little bit more. So if you are trying to use Gardens as an alternate source of victory points, and you can generate a huge number of buys. On your very last turn, you can just buy coppers, right? You exchange every buy for a copper, because coppers don't cost money. And you may find that each of your Gardens you get to push up by 1 more point, and that can sometimes be all you need to gain just enough points to win the game. Of course, another pile that is available, like Curses and also Ruins, but you usually don't buy Curses as like a third pile to end the game because you lose points when you play it. Well, if when you're buying those Curses, a couple of Gardens in your deck suddenly go up in value, then you're not actually losing as many points as you might have thought from Curses. But you don't really see that very often. But I'm just sort of putting it here as an example of how sometimes you can use a whole load of buys to just throw a whole bunch of stuff into your deck right at the end of the game. It's important that you don't buy a lot of junk too early. Obviously, if you start buying a whole load of coppers really early on, then any sort of proper engine that you hope to build is just going to collapse pretty quickly because all the coppers will get in the way, and then you're not going to have these turns filled with a gazillion plus buys anymore because you can't play your engine anymore. Right, it all just gets clogged up with this junk. But it's something to keep in mind. You can squeak a few more points out of Gardens if you're going to need them with stuff like that. So what about junking attacks? We just talked about Curses. Well, what about if your opponent's got like a Witch and they're throwing junks into your deck? So that can contribute towards a third pile. And also, if you might think to yourself, well, hey, if I gain all 10 Curses, then every Gardens is going to be worth an extra point, right? So that sort of offsets the loss a bit, and therefore it makes it seem like being cursed isn't so bad. Bear in mind that the worst part of cursing isn't necessarily losing the points. It's actually the fact that the Curses are unplayable trash. just awful cards in your deck that make it really hard to do anything of value. The big problem and why Gardens isn't actually as good against junking as you might think, even though junking bloats your deck, is because if you have a load of junk, you really struggle to actually do anything in the game. You lose your ability to decide when you get to empty 3 piles, because you just can't gain cards very quickly because you're not drawing anything, right? If all you can do is buy a copper, then you're not actually contributing to the end of the game, and your whole deck just slows down, and your opponent then gets a whole load of time to actually catch up with something way better like Provinces. So Gardens isn't the super counter to junking that new players might think it is, and all this stuff kind of contributes a bit to Gardens, but it's actually bad decks. You sort of don't want bad decks a lot of the time, basically. So letting yourself get junked and buying a load of victory cards, your deck's just going to be absolutely terrible. So it's not good, right? Gardens is too slow with how quickly it gains points to be a good counter to junking a lot of the time. And all this sort of leads on to an important point, which is that Province and Colony are really, really good as victory cards. They're very, very efficient in terms of how many points they give per coin that you spend, and also the fact that they give quite a lot of points for just adding 1 stop card into your deck. So we said really early on that a lot of decks just can't handle a lot of victory cards, and that's generally true. Province is so good because it's just not adding a lot of cards to your deck. Duchy is way, way worse than Province, although it's half the points for just slightly more than half the cost. That's not really the problem. It's really bad in terms of stop cards that you throw in. If you consider you need twice as many duchies just to get the same number of points as Province, not only spending more money, but also your deck falls apart very quickly a lot of the time. And if Duchy is cheaper than 5, and it only costs 4, well, it's still the case that it's twice as many stock cards, and that's quite bad. So even when you consider Gardens is the same sort of value as Duchy, you've got at least 30 cards in your deck, and it's just a cheaper Duchy, it's still not necessarily going to be very good, and that's just because you don't want a lot of victory cards a lot of the time. For your deck to be able to handle quite a lot, you usually need some specific support. So a card like Cellar, which is really, really good filtering if you've got a good engine going, that can really help out in terms of making it viable to use Gardens instead of Provinces. But generally, you don't want to add enormous amounts of overdraw to your deck if you can help it. Once your engine is up and running and you're drawing everything you need, ideally you just get through Provinces very quickly. That's sort of what a lot of decks try to do because it's so good and because Province is such a good card. So that means that Garden tends to be very weak overall. So we talked a lot about specific combos in this video, but actually Gardens is not a super great card, and that's just because it doesn't really compare with Province very well. Province is just exceptional, and that's important for the game that that's the case, right? But Gardens just... You usually don't want a lot of cheap victory cards. What you actually want is a small number of very expensive and efficient victory cards instead. That's sort of a general game rule for most of the time. All rules in Dominion, because the game has so much variety, these rules get broken, and it's sort of impossible to give you an 100% all the time rule. But generally... you don't want lots of victory cards. You just want very few, very good victory cards. And Gardens doesn't really help in that regard. So Gardens overall, if you find that you aren't buying Gardens a lot of the time, well, that's sort of how Gardens is, right? It's just actually not very strong. Although there are ways to make it better that we just discussed. So just to give you a summary, because this is a really, really long video, there are some very powerful combos out there with Gardens. Like a lot of cards, sometimes just things really work in its favour. In most kingdoms, it's going to be like having another pile of duchies that are a little bit cheaper, and it gives you more opportunity to gain them. Some cards that like to gain cards only like gaining cheap ones, and Gardens works with those. It does scale up, but it's very, very slow scaling a lot of the time. You usually want to be gaining at least 3 cards per turn, but if you're doing that, then you find that sometimes you just end the game instead. You don't really have time to pick up Gardens. Like I've just discussed here, victory cards really clog up decks. Usually it's okay to only want to add provinces to your deck if you can help it. That doesn't mean you always will. Sometimes you have to buy duchies to stop your opponent winning. But, in the ideal world, you sort of would like to only have provinces. It's just way easier. You have to build less and it's faster to just pick up the provinces because you have less victory stop cards in your deck. Kingdoms will sometimes support multiple paths to victory, sometimes they won't, but if they do, then Gardens can help versus province by the nature of being another pile of cards that you can use. So, you need to not forget about that, but bear in mind that alternate paths versus province, sometimes there will be specific combos, but a lot of the time, like adding 6 or 7 duchies to your deck isn't really going to compare to a nice small number of provinces that you gain consistently instead. So that was Gardens. That was a long video. Let's just make our way over to the online client, and we are going to generate some random kingdoms that involve Gardens. Here we go. We're going to assess how it goes. So I'd say in the base game only, Gardens is not super great in second edition, but let's see how this is. So we have no trashing here. We have our village and smithy. The only we've got festival and council room. We've got bandit to gain golds. So a big problem here is the lack of trashing. Trying to build a draw engine seems tough. Council room draws quite a lot, but it helps your opponent too. But is it actually viable to go for more than one province if it's really hard to draw? Well, throne room can help. You can get quite a lot of draw off of smithy. But otherwise, the engine's quite difficult here. But I think you're still looking to get one province per turn fairly quickly. I don't think the engine's bad enough to only do smithy big money. You've got all the villages, you've got the draw. The problem that this deck has is sort of what do you want to do once you're drawing your deck? Vassal and merchant are not great here because there's no trashing. So that sort of leaves you with only bandit as sort of the only thing that you are doing if you manage to draw your deck. And you can do it. Maybe you do look to village smithy and draw pass, but it's going to take a while and it's not going to be super great. But Gardens is never going to work out here. The only cards that give you more than one gain per turn, Festival and Council Room, and if you're, it's just not good enough for Gardens. Generally, the person who gets the most provinces is going to win, so that's what you want to focus on. I think Gardens is largely ignorable here. If you do get any, it'll be a last-minute desperation play for points, I would say. They're going to be worth a reasonable amount. I think they're going to be at least a duchy. I think it's probably unlikely that they're going to be worth more than that. So it's nice that there's a cheaper duchy here, but otherwise Gardens is just not really worthwhile on that board. If you don't get any, it would be no surprise. So what about this board? So we've got Sentry and Moneylender to trash. There is no village. There is militia. Sorry, I haven't done this. Here we go. So there is militia, which seems quite nasty. What's the draw? It's only terminal draw with council room and moat. So militia's quite strong here. You can't increase your hand size without playing this. So we want to be playing militia as often as possible. So we're going to trash down. I think maybe, do we open militia? I think so, because you want to get a sentry or 2 or 3. And you're looking to really play militia every turn. I think that means a lot of the other cards are not very good. But I can see getting a market, gaining a bunch of merchants. You will probably ideally like to do some sort of cantrip kingdom style thing where you're just playing markets and merchants and a silver, and you're looking to play militia every turn. It would be real nice to get an artisan and pick up a load of sentries, but I don't think you can. So I think instead you are just going to... I think the person who can consistently play militia every turn is probably going to win. Even like council room's going to struggle against that. And that's what you do. And you look to buy 1 province per turn. And you do that by getting up to market, buying a load of merchants with a silver. You can't really support that many stock cards, but if you get enough sentries, which you might be able to pick up now and then, you can hope that you get to discard past the victory cards once you've adding them into your deck. I think Gardens is no good here. there's just no support for it, and there's good trashing with Sentry, and the Gardens isn't worth anything, really. You can't afford to clog your deck up with Gardens, because there's nothing else that you can do. If you clog up your deck with Gardens, there's no way to support having a whole load of victory cards in this deck, no matter what. So, yeah, so Gardens is sort of ignored there. What do we have here? So, here's Workshop Gardens, but before we look at that, we have Trashing with Sentry and Moneylender. Again, there's Militia. The only draw is Library. Is Library good here? What do you get to play to decrease your hand size? Workshop and Militia and Moneylender. And mine, but not really mine. Drawing is quite hard, therefore, in this case. What are you looking to do? I think you still have a Library. But do you want to play Militia every turn if your opponent has a Library? Yeah, probably. I mean, Militia can help Library, but the reality is that you still would rather have a 7-card hand, and if you're not Militia in your opponent, they might be playing Library anyway. If your opponent gets a Library, maybe you can start. How are you actually? Is this engine bad enough that Workshop Gardens is good? There's no plus buy. You can gain villages, and like throne rooms and Militia, but I don't think you really want to go for an engine where you're using Library to do throne room, Militia, and something for a province. Workshop Gardens might be competitive on this board, and I think. But does 1 province per turn? How quickly can you get up to 1 province per turn? I think once the player trying to gain provinces, their deck will sputter out. Well, there is Cellar, which is nice for Library, actually. I don't think Workshop Gardens is good enough, actually. I think you can go for 1 province a turn using Library and Trashing with Sentry. And yeah, you're going to be doing something like a Throne Room and a Militia for 4 of your money. And then you might have like 2 silvers left over or something at the end, and that gets you your 8 in province. But I think there's enough going on that you can reasonably expect to pick up a province every turn with a 8-card hand, and I think in either case actually Militia's not very good on this board, and that is just because if the player goes Library, it's fine, maybe it actually helps them a little bit, and if they go Workshop Gardens, then the Militia doesn't matter at all. So I think the engine is okay here. I think you can gain enough provinces to outscore the Workshop Gardens rush. Like, it's just a little bit too slow, and that's just because you can have like a 7-card hand every turn. So, yeah, I think Gardens is ignored on this board, but I thought about it. If that's 3-player or something, then you may find that if multiple people go Workshop Gardens, it will win. What about this board? So, Festival Library seems nice, but where's the trashing? It's only remodel, and the coppers are really bad here. But Library's the only draw. You got Market to gain you got Artisan to gain markets and throne rooms. Well, Throne Room Festival, still not bad. Really do not like the coppers, though. You definitely want to remodel, but you can't turn the coppers into anything. You can throne remodel to chop coppers if they end up in your hand, and although you'll at first only turn them into estates, that's enough to lower your hand size to get another draw out of Library, and then maybe later you can throne room the estates into more throne rooms or something. So I think you can go Festival Library here. At the very least, Gardens is doing nothing on this board. What sort of support is there? You can gain some buys. It's funny, if the player goes Festival Library and gains some markets and has an Artisan, they can actually gain a whole bunch of buys, and could even at the end of the game buy a bunch of Gardens for extra points and a load of coppers. You can end up with quite a lot of buys with Throne Room as well. I can easily see you having 10 buys at the end of a turn, but I still think provinces are going to be important. There's not really any support for Gardens as a strategy. Again, it's just going to be something like you buy the Gardens at the end. It could actually be more valuable than Duchy. It could actually get to a state where you have so many buys, you can buy 10 cards at the end, and then you have, especially because you cannot actually decrease the, you can trash away with remodel your starting cards, but you can't do much better. I think this is Festival Library with Artisan. Artisan can gain some gardens as well at the end, but I think province is still your main goal here. But I think gardens could actually have some end game play on that board. You could find you're able to beat an opponent if it's a tight, close game by just having gardens, but it's not a strategy on its own. So we've got Workshop Gardens again here. Is it any good? Well, there's no village at all. Wow, this is terrible. Yeah, so these cards are going to be real bad because there is no trashing except Moneylender. So you do not want these cards. Artisan can gain you like markets, but you don't care because gaining market Artisan doesn't seem very good. Does Workshop Gardens beat Council Room Big Money? I think it does, actually. Yeah, so I think this is Workshop Gardens just because there's really nothing else to do. What do you do in this game? If you get an Artisan, the 5-cost cards you have, you don't really want that much. Yeah, this is just so weak as a board. I think you Workshop Gardens here, just because there's nothing else for the other player to do. Council Room Big Money is not actually that good. Maybe it does win, though. Oh, I don't know. Can you get that many provinces in enough time? Maybe you can. It's a lot of cards for you, and actually, Council Room's extra card draw for the other player does not help the Workshop Gardens player at all. So I think, actually, you may be able to Council Room Big Money and beat the Workshop Gardens player. Council Room, if that each other player draws a card doesn't apply to an opponent's strategy, then it's really good. If you go Council Room Big Money, then the other player does like the fact that you're drawing them an extra card, and it's quite helpful. But I really don't see what sort of engine's going to go on here. So it's going to be one of those two, and I think Council Room Big Money might be better. On the other hand, if you draw them an extra card, they're more likely to be able to play a Workshop, gain a Gardens, and then buy a Gardens, and that's actually quite nice for the Workshop Gardens player. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not so hot on which is better out of the various big money strategies versus Workshop Gardens, I'm afraid. But I think I would probably go Council Room Big Money, but I can see Workshop Gardens being a thing here. And again, if this is multiplayer and multiple people go for Workshop Gardens, then it's going to win just because if 2 people are hitting those piles. The game's just going to end very quickly. And I don't think Big Money Council Room can stop that because it's just too fast. So there you go. So that was Gardens. Gardens, even though I said that it didn't seem very relevant on some boards, you can still use it as a part of just opportunistically. It becomes available in the end game as like a replacement for Duchy, and you just buy it because you just want any victory card for points, and it's nice and cheap. But it struggles to be province. And usually with all sorts of weak cards, if the board is weak, then you might find that it's more relevant. That's when stuff like Workshop Gardens comes into play. But overall, Gardens, you're actually going to ignore it most of the time. And that's just because cheap victory cards that aren't worth many points are just not very good in general. You usually try to avoid them and build an engine that doesn't have many crappy stock cards in it. So yeah, so Gardens, it's okay. It's below average. It's way below average. It's pretty weak overall, but you see it happen sometimes. Yeah, so that was quite a long video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.